Alright, back again. This time we're talking about Article 2, the executive branch. Article 2 is all about the president and what the president does and the people that help the president. So, in looking at the executive branch, we're saying that the president basically carries out the law, executes the law, enforces the law. Doesn't matter what verb you use, he's basically taking the laws passed by Congress and simply putting it into action. So, what do we need to know? We need to know that the president has to be at least 35. He must also be a native-born citizen. That means he has to be born an American citizen, not a naturalized citizen. That's someone who was born in a foreign country, but then comes to this country to become an American citizen. He also has to live here at least 14 years. So the president takes all the laws that are sent to him by Congress that he approves and must enforce those laws. We elect the president every 4 years. So right now we're in the process of starting the primary season coming up in January 2016. And by November of 2016, we will be electing a president, and a new president in this case, because constitutionally now, you can only serve 2 terms of office. So that's going to be 4 years apiece, a max of 10 years. And this is the 22nd Amendment. The reason why it's a max of 10 years, if something happens to the president during, let's say, his second term of office, he dies, he resigns from office, the vice president takes over. That way the vice president has a little bit of wiggle room to still serve out the remainder of that term of that president, but also serve 2 additional terms. How do we elect the president? It's the electoral college system. We've talked about this. There are 538 electoral votes. The president has to get the magic number of 270, which is one more than half, a simple majority. We determine electoral votes per state based on the representation of the members of Congress that represent that state. For instance, in this state, we have 15 electoral votes. That means that there are 2 in the Senate and 13 in the House of Representatives. You just need the magic number of 270. It's an indirect method of electing the president, because when you're voting on election day, what you're really voting for are the electoral votes. The people who are going to represent your state, who are going to cast those votes to basically add up to whoever becomes the president to get that magic number. The other things about the president, and these are just sort of like fluff things, he has a place to live, the White House. That's also where he works. He has access to transportation, Air Force One, Marine One. He also receives a salary of over $400,000 a year. He also receives travel expenses when he travels to foreign countries. So let's say talk to the president of France. He's going to stay in a hotel. He's going to have some travel money so that he can spend to, I don't know, buy gifts for his kids or his wife. The president also has use of Camp David, which is a vacation spot in Maryland. He doesn't have to use it. He can simply go back to, his home state if he wants to vacation. So the current president, Obama, is spending his Christmas holiday in Hawaii because that's where he basically grew up. President Bush would spend time in Texas because that's where his ranch was, or where his ranch currently is, excuse me. So the president has a lot of privileges, and he does make a considerable amount of money. But when you compare it to, say, like an athlete playing professional baseball who's making $15 million a year to play a sport, really and truthfully, he's not really making that much. Plus the stress of the job sometimes makes you even wonder if it's worth the $400,000+ a year. The vice president constitutionally is the president of the Senate, but over time has evolved with power, because the vice president does take over if something happens to the president. The first time this happens is in 1841. William Henry Harrison dies. He only serves for roughly 30 days. He gets really sick and he dies. And then his presidential VP candidate, John Tyler, takes over as president. We officially have a Presidential Succession Act that was passed in 1947 that says if something happens to the president, the vice president takes over. If something happens to the vice president, the Speaker of the House takes over. And it's a long line of succession through the leadership of the House and Senate, as well as the presidential cabinet. Really and truthfully, it doesn't really get much past the VP. We also have the 25th Amendment, that if something happens to the president, he gets sick, he has a stroke, he's in the hospital, he's hooked up to machines to keep him alive, the vice president takes over. Okay, so we do make sure that there's always someone in charge. As far as what the president does, as far as his duties are to enforce the law. He's the most recognizable figure in this country. He is the only elected official that's elected by all the people of this country. His job is to maintain national defense, national security. He's commander-in-chief. He can pardon criminals. He can, make treaties with foreign nations. He can meet with foreign leaders. He gives State of the Union address each year that he's president. It typically happens sometime in January. But he also serves other roles. As chief executive, he enforces the law. As chief diplomat, he basically negotiates treaties and sometimes can enter into what is called executive agreements, handshake agreements with other countries. He also can negotiate peace treaties with other countries. If two countries are disagreeing and are going to war, the president can go in and negotiate a peace agreement between those countries. He can appoint ambassadors to represent this country in foreign countries. He is basically the beacon of freedom, and his job is to make sure that people are free in the world and not just in this country, and to maintain human rights. He also is commander-in-chief, which means that he can, bomb a country, such as the current situation with ISIS. His job is to use military force, airstrikes, to hit ISIS targets to prevent terrorist acts from happening in this country. If he decides to send troops to a foreign country, the War Powers Act kicks in. And the way this works is the president decides he wants to send 10,000 troops to Syria. He has 48 hours to tell Congress what he's doing. He then has 60 days in which to get a declaration of war. If he does not receive a declaration of war from Congress within those 60 days, those troops must come home. This is to prevent another Vietnam. Vietnam happened in the late 50s with our involvement in that area, dealing with communism spreading in Southeast Asia, and it didn't end until the mid-70s, and we never had a declaration of war. So the War Powers Act limits the president's ability to wage war. It creates a two-step process to prevent another Vietnam. He is also a legislative leader, which means that he can promote certain bills to be passed by Congress, and he does so through his political party. So looking at the current president, Obama had the Affordable Care Act as his pet project to have universal health care in this country. People who did not have health care, to provide a low-cost insurance package so people would then have medical benefits. He could not actually pass the law himself. He had to get Congress to do it for him, and he had the Democrats, his fellow Democrats, to do that. He is also head of state, which is ceremonial. Basically, he will meet with foreign leaders when they're newly elected, or he will have the Easter egg hunt on the White House lawn, or pardon a turkey for Thanksgiving, or lighting the Christmas tree. His job is to basically show that he cares about the same things that we care about that are a part of our American culture. He also is economic leader, which means that he can prepare a budget. He's required to prepare a budget for the federal government. Problem is, Congress does not even have to use that budget. They can simply create their own budget. But it is constitutionally required that the president create a budget for Congress to review. He is also the party leader, which means that his job is to support people in his party. So if there is a governor of a state who's a Democrat who's trying to get elected governor, the president, who is a Democrat, is going to try to support that person to help them to get the position. Other things about the president that you need to know is the fact that he can sign executive orders. Executive orders are not a part of the Constitution, though. It is simply something that the president has created over time. The president will sign an executive order saying that it is necessary for this law, it's not really a law, to be passed by him so that he can execute his job. Executive orders such as desegregating the nation's military, that was done by Harry Truman. The executive order that was signed about a year ago by the president, which was to give undocumented illegal aliens legal status. That was a controversial executive order that was recently signed. So the president does have this ability to create something that has the force of law that allows him to do his job. And it can create some controversy, especially if it is a executive order that goes against the other political party, in this case Republicans, what they view is necessary for our government to operate. Pardon me. Excuse me one more time. So, other things about the executive branch. One of the big things that the president does is dealing with foreign nations. And it's not always using the military. He can use what are called embargoes. This is when he gets other countries to not trade with a country that we're having an issue with. He can hand down trade sanctions, which is to directly punish a country economically for something that they're doing. He can also enter into, we said, treaties. He can sign treaties, which must be approved by the Senate. Or he can have a handshake agreement with another country, some sort of economic agreement or a military agreement. This is called an executive agreement. He has various groups that help him to do this job. He has the National Security Council, the Department of State, the Department of Defense, the CIA. They're all going to advise the president in doing his job. He also has what is called the Presidential Cabinet. The Presidential Cabinet, basically, their job is to advise the president in areas of federal government that are specific to that cabinet department. And there are a lot of cabinet departments. Just to go through them real quick, we have the Department of State, the Department of Treasury, the Department of Defense, Department of Justice, Department of the Interior, Department of Agriculture, Department of Labor, Department of Commerce, Department of Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, Department of Education, Department of Veteran Affairs, and Department of Homeland Security. Their job basically is to focus on their area of government to advise the president on what the president should do in making decisions. As far as the First Lady is concerned, she has no political power. There's nothing about her in the Constitution. However, she does have people who work in her office to help the First Lady to promote things that the president wants to achieve, or maybe a project that the First Lady thinks is really important. The federal bureaucracy is like a spider web. And this federal bureaucracy, basically what it is the day-to-day functions of government. Their job is to do all the little things that the president obviously cannot deal with on a day-to-day basis. There are three types of federal bureaucracy agencies. There are what are called independent agencies, or sometimes called executive agencies. Their job is to deal with specialized areas of government. So, for example, NASA. NASA deals with space exploration. And their job is to do things that promote the federal government, to send satellites into outer space that could be used for the CIA to, gather intelligence on a foreign nation or a terrorist group. You have what are called government corporations. Their job is to provide services to this country that we do not privatize. So, for instance, the U.S. Postal Service, their job is to send out the mail. Amtrak, their job is to provide train transportation for citizens. Then we have what are called, excuse me, my apologies. we have what are called regulatory boards and commissions. Their job is to regulate things in the federal government, like the FCC. Their job is to regulate communications in this country, or the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. Their job is to monitor and regulate the stock market. How do you get a job working with the federal bureaucracy? Well, it's called the civil service system. And the civil service system requires that you go through a application process. There are going to be some sort of interviews and tests that you take to show that you have an aptitude to handle the day-to-day job, that you can deal with things without having to have it specifically written out for you, that you can use logic and reasoning. The purpose of the federal bureaucracy, the reason why we created the civil service system, was to prevent the spoil system, so that when a new president comes in, we don't want the president to just give jobs to people that he's friends with. We want to make sure they're qualified for the position. So, with the U.S. executive branch, the qualifications of the president, the basic functions, the roles the president plays, and the fact that one of his primary focuses is on foreign policy, and the last resort is military force, because the War Powers Act limits the president's ability to use military force for good reason. We don't want another Vietnam type circumstance going on in our country. Those are the things that you need to know about the executive branch. Next up, we're going to look at the North Carolina executive branch and specifically speak about the North Carolina governor. After that, we're going to be moving on to Unit 6, which is the judicial branch. Until then, see you later.